It's working very well. I think we'll make a start then. And welcome to the first of this semester's Gold Dream Lectures. Often on these occasions people will say it's a great pleasure to introduce such and such. It's genuinely true tonight. I'm delighted to welcome Phil back to Harlexton. He worked here as a teaching fellow between 2009 and 2012. And then went off, as you may have seen from some of the publicity material, went off to India for 3 years before returning fairly recently, both to raise a child and also to work at the University of London, Royal Holloway. And some of what we're going to hear tonight is based on some of the records and archives that they have at Royal Holloway. Although Phil is a musicologist, he's going to be thinking rather more about issues of global citizenship and international education this evening. So I hope you'll join with me in welcoming Phil to talk about the splendid spirit of internationalism, global education and the British University.
Thank you. It is a real pleasure to be back at Harlexton. I'm having a bit of a nostalgia trip. I had 3 fantastic years here. And there's a bit of a prologue to this lecture, so bear with me before we get started on the kind of real topic. Because when I was planning this lecture last year, I realised that 2 of my former Harlexton students are currently back in the UK at the moment studying postgraduate programmes. So I was kind of mulling over these issues of internationalism, global citizenship, you know, thinking about the Harlexton experience. Harlexton was really my starting point for thinking about the international dimension of higher education. So I'm going to start with a couple of quotations from former Harlexton students. Through the power of Facebook, I messaged them and said, you know, tell me what you think about global citizenship 5 years later. So this is Ryan Vanell from WKU, coincidentally studying now at my institution, Royal Holloway. He's kind of into broadcasting and sort of stuff. And so Ryan says, it's cheesy to say, but Harlexton College truly changed my life. It is cheesy. So he went on to do other study abroad. I realised these opportunities changed me. They made me want to learn and experience as much as I could about our planet. And Ryan was awarded a Fulbright Award last summer, and he's back studying in London. Your Harlexton experience doesn't have to end when you leave the manor. Isn't that great? Put that on the website. Also, Christy, she's doing occupational health up in Edinburgh. After Harlexton, I noticed a change in myself. I felt a drive to be more knowledgeable about the issues that were happening around the world globally. Christy went on the Scotland weekend trip, fell in love with Edinburgh, and is now back studying in Edinburgh. The opportunities that I've had to work in international schools and hospitals, as well as gain a strong understanding of the inner networking of the NHS, is an experience I wouldn't have had in the USA. I'm very grateful for my time at Harlexton, and so on and so on. So we know the power of kind of education at Harlexton and what this experience can mean for you in the future, even if you don't realise it now. That's the interesting thing, you know, several years later, students still kind of putting this experience into practice. As David said, when I left Harlexton 5 years ago, I went to teach in India, in South India, in the city of Chennai. I was teaching on a British degree programme being delivered in India. So it's an example of what we call kind of transnational education. It raises a lot of interesting questions about kind of cultural context for education and cultural differences between the West and East. I came back to the UK a couple of years ago and took up this role, kind of moved from academia into the dark side of administration, I'm sorry to say, and quality assurance. But, you know, I needed a job. I was 35, unemployed, what can you do? And my job now is kind of managing the international programmes and at Royal Holloway. And again, as part of this role, kind of started to look at our institutional history to try and figure out what internationalism means for our university. And what I want to do a little bit this evening is just kind of introduce you to a bit of this history, but also the first part of the lecture, talk about the situation today with British higher education and the kind of global dimension that British universities find themselves operating in. So to start with my title, the splendid spirit of internationalism is a quotation from an unpublished essay by an American nurse who was writing in the 1930s about her experience of teaching international students in London, the students in the photograph. And I'll explain more about these circumstances later on. But I came across this line whilst I was browsing through my university's digital archives, a lot of material available online. And this idea of a spirit of internationalism struck me as capturing something really vital about the values that inform higher education in Britain. Today we're perhaps more likely to use the term globalism rather than internationalism. But both these terms imply some sort of ideological commitment to the values of international cooperation and tolerance. So what I want to do this evening is to explore the concept of internationalism as it applies today and as it developed during the 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly in relation to the history of the University of London and also the development of higher education for women in Britain. Now, I'm aware that we're kind of jumping ahead of ourselves in terms of your British Studies lecture narrative, because you're only at Tudors, is that right, at the moment? So when we get to the kind of Victorian and stuff in 1920s, 1930s, you'll have to kind of store this, but it will be useful in like a few weeks' time. You know, if you put this in the exam paper in a few weeks, you know, you get credit for it. British universities today are amongst the most globalised in the world, if we can say that, if it's possible to say that. Academics collaborate on international research projects. Courses are adapted to reflect global learning outcomes. Campuses are home to very diverse groups of international students and staff. And universities export their degree programmes into overseas markets. Many British universities now effectively operate as global multinational corporations, engaging in an active process of internationalisation, becoming more global through the decisions they make about recruitment, programme design, and the movement of students and staff. And just a few sort of facts and figures to put a little bit of context around this. I won't go through all this. This is data compiled by the international branch of Universities UK, who are the sort of representative group for all British universities, the kind of trade body, if you like. So they represent universities' interests. You can see in 2014-15, there were 436,000 international students studying in the UK. And those students contributed about £9 billion to the UK economy. That's in 2011 and 12. That figure will have increased markedly since then. That is a significant contribution to the economy, and in fact the UK higher education sector as a whole contributes about 2% to Britain's GDP, which is 4 times that of agriculture. Okay, so it's a kind of big business. Over a quarter of the academic staff working in British universities are from overseas. And a lot of the research that these academic staff are doing involves some element of international collaboration. Apologies for those of you at the back who won't be able to read the small print. Almost 50% of research published in the UK in 2012 involves some kind of international collaboration. And a lot of the research funding also comes from overseas. So that's the kind of just a little bit of a sort of picture for what we're talking about. This so-called internationalisation agenda has become so influential that it has itself now become the subject of critique, partly because it feeds into concerns about the commodification and commercialisation of higher education and the uneven benefits of economic globalisation. But it also poses some quite interesting and fundamental questions about the purpose of the modern university. What are universities for? What role do they serve in British society and, by extension, global society? How should we fund universities and so on? Looking at the British higher education sector as a whole reveals a collective commitment to global values. University websites and prospectuses are deeply infused with the rhetoric of globalism. And British universities cooperate to further their mutual interests, making sure that international students are attracted to the UK rather than Australia or the United States or Singapore. And universities attempt to lobby the UK government to influence higher education policy. Since 2011, the British government has been running an influential marketing campaign around the world to promote the UK in key overseas markets, in 3 areas: trade and investment, tourism and study. And universities have played a key role in this, as we can see. So, research, look, we have some liquid, there are bubbles, it's science, it's great. And, why would you not want to come and stand in this library and look at a book? And the iconography is fairly straightforward. It's great, got the Union flag, and it's not at all clear, actually, when you look at this marketing material, that it's the government that's behind it. It's quite a stealthy kind of operation that's been happening, and it's been very successful. The data shows it's bringing in a lot of money into the UK. And I got caught up in this so-called GREAT campaign when I was out in India. So this is bizarre. If you think about the history of Britain and India, this is a very strange situation in terms of kind of cultural politics. So this is me, a British academic, conducting my choir of Indian students in India, but who are studying on a British degree programme at the British Deputy High Commission. So this chap here, Ashok, is a British Indian now representing the British government in India. And we're performing the British and Indian national anthems at a party to celebrate the Queen's birthday. And it's not even on the Queen's birthday. This was in April. Because it's too hot in Chennai in May when it's the actual birthday, whenever it actually is. So, very strange. And, this kind of great marketing campaign. It's all about, the High Commission described it as a diplomatic soft power. So this is about promoting the relationship between Britain and India, in this case through higher education. A slightly different manifestation of this collective action can be seen in the social media campaign #WeAreInternational. I don't really know what a hashtag is, but I should just, whatever it is. This was founded by the University of Sheffield in 2013 to promote the values of international scholarship and the contribution that international students bring to the UK. And it's supported by hundreds of universities, business groups and commercial organisations. And the question you might want to ask is, why do we need a social media campaign to persuade people that internationalism is a good thing? What's that kind of working against? Whilst all this seems positive, we know that the global values fostered by British universities do not necessarily reflect the views of the rest of British society. Despite the impressive symbolism of the GREAT campaign, the reality of government immigration policy in recent years has made it increasingly difficult for overseas students to obtain study visas for the UK. Universities have been at war with the Home Office on this issue for several years. The government, as we know, is under pressure to reduce the immigration figures by whatever means necessary. Universities, for their part, argue that, as we've seen, international students are a net economic benefit to the UK. And also, crucially, there's research to show that the public do not perceive international students as immigrants. They see them as short-term visitors who come, study, spend, and then go home. And we know that's the case here, right? I mean, what would happen to the pubs in Grantham if Harlexton closed down? There are economic consequences for international education. The biggest indication of discord between universities and public sentiment, of course, came in June last year with the Brexit vote. This came as a massive shock to the higher education sector. It's thrown into doubt the future of European research funding and the free movement of students and academic staff. And I think there are also much deeper concerns about the kind of symbolism of the Brexit vote and what that means for Britain's role in overseas recruitment markets and so on. As we know, 2016 was a useful reminder perhaps, that the concept of globalism is not neutral. It operates against changing international economic and political conditions. So now we're going to play Guess the Quotation time. Who said this last year? Today, too many people in positions of power behave as though they have more in common with international elites than with the people down the road, the people they employ, the people they pass on the street. But if you believe that you are a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. You don't understand what citizenship means. Who said that? Yeah. You know. Any guesses? Come on, have a guess.
Was it Rama Karaj?
No, sorry. It was our Prime Minister. Okay. Well. Next up, there is no global anthem, no global currency, no certificate of global citizenship. We pledge allegiance to one flag, and that flag is the American flag. Global is wonderful, but right now we want to focus on our national community. Yeah, probably. That was a bit easier, okay. Okay, there's a lot we could say here. Let's just leave them to their special relationship. There's a basic misconception here, of course, about what citizenship means and the idea that national and global citizenship are mutually exclusive. But there is a glimmer of hope. Okay, so BBC commissioned some research tracking opinion polls in 14 different countries around the world from the last 15 years, from 2001 onwards. Okay, and what you can see overall, generally, is an increase in personal allegiance to the idea of global citizenship. So, response to the question, seeing myself more as a global citizen than a citizen of my country. Okay, and the overall data is the light blue line in the middle. Now, what's interesting is this is divided into OECD countries. So, the non-OECD countries, what we say countries from the global south, emerging or developing economies, India, Mexico, Russia, these sorts of places. More than half of people identify more as a global citizen than a national citizen. And that data includes Russia, which is a complete global outlier. Because in Russia, national identity is off the scale. I think it's about 4% of people who identify with the idea of global citizenship, which tells us a lot about kind of Putin's Russia. But for kind of our countries, the OECD countries, so United States, UK, France, Germany, and so on, slightly lower, but still 42%. It'd be very interesting to see what happens to this data, obviously, after 2016. But the interesting thing, of course, is a massive crash just after 2008. And perhaps what this tells us is that the concept of global citizenship is kind of aligned with how things are happening in the global economy. So global economic downturn in 2008, and all of a sudden people are feeling less positive about the idea of global citizenship. But maybe some sort of interesting changes overall looking at that trend. So the question facing UK universities today is, what does it mean to be internationalist? What does it mean in 2017, given this changing political context, for universities to say they are committed to global citizenship? We've been thinking about this quite a lot at my institution, Royal Holloway. And one starting point is to look into the historical development of higher education and try and put the role of internationalism into a broader historical perspective. So now for the historical bit. Are there any questions before I go on at this point? Because by the end of the lecture, this will seem like a very long time ago. So let's crack on. Now, there's often a tendency to assume that study abroad is a modern phenomenon. But here's a question for you. When did the first international student come to study at a British university? It's not the Victorian era, is it?
12th century.
Bang on, Dr. Green. The earliest international student we know about came to study at Oxford University in 1190. This was the splendidly named Emo of Friesland. He was a theologian and priest from near Groningen, which is near the kind of modern Netherlands and Germany kind of region. Emo came to study at Oxford in 1190. Okay, so international students have been coming here for quite a long time. That's about the same time the first parish church was built at Harlexton. The earliest European universities were very cosmopolitan institutions, home to multinational communities of students and teachers learning alongside each other. The freedom of movement of students and staff creating international networks of scholarship has been a basic principle underpinning the European university system for a very long time. And if we had more time, it would be great to talk more about medieval universities, except that I'd be a bit scared of doing that with David right in front of me. So we'll move on to the Victorian era. And, okay, stuff happens, right, between the medieval period and the Victorian era. But it's fine, it's British studies, so, you know, some stuff happens, and then we arrive in the 19th century. And it's good to be back. It is the Victorian era when we start to see the origins of what we recognise as our modern university system. The Victorian era witnessed changing progressive attitudes towards higher education, and this was reflected in the emergence of several new universities. These institutions reflected the impact of the Industrial Revolution. They began as scientific and technical colleges. They specialised in vocational subjects such as engineering and medicine. And they had an important civic function through their location in the rapidly growing industrialised cities such as Liverpool, Leeds and Manchester. So the purpose of these new institutions was to provide advanced training to a growing population and to produce the professional expertise that was needed to further Britain's industrial ambitions. All this was in stark contrast to the so-called ancient universities of Oxford and Cambridge, where the curriculum was still essentially medieval. They're still teaching theology, classics and so on. And, crucially, where entry was still restricted to unmarried male members of the Anglican Church. So if you wanted to get into Oxford or Cambridge, even into the early 1800s, you had to be a man, you had to be unmarried, and you had to be an Anglican. If you think about all the people that excludes in the British population, you can see that those universities are recruiting from quite a narrow talent pool. The most influential of the new Victorian universities was the University of London, which was founded in 1836 with the merger of two colleges, University College London and King's College London. And this is a contemporary engraving of the London University, as it subsequently became known, University College London. Does that building look familiar? What does it look like?
National Gallery.
Yeah, same architect, same guy designed University UCL and the National Gallery in Trafalgar Square. The University of London was founded as an exam board that granted degrees to students from affiliated colleges, and the idea was to broaden access to higher education. Crucially also, it was non-denominational, okay, so it was not founded on religious lines, it was open to everyone, well, to all men. As well as the two London colleges, it also awarded degrees to the students in Manchester, Liverpool and Leeds before they gained full university status, as well as many other smaller independent institutions across Britain, including Roman Catholic colleges, for example, and working men's institutions. Incidentally, Oxford and Cambridge were horrified by the idea that university degrees were being opened up to new sections of society. Some might say this is still the case today. But today, that was a joke, come on. Right. You've got to try hard, haven't you? Today, the University of London is a unique federal organisation with 27 members, several of which are world-leading institutions in their own right. London School of Economics, London Business School. You've got a mixture of kind of what you might call normal universities, King's College London, and then it's kind of specialised institutions that specialise in music, hygiene and tropical medicine. SOAS is the School of Oriental and African Studies. Part of what made the University of London innovative in the 19th century was that it distinguished between teaching and examination, between the process of learning and the process of assessment. This meant that working class men in a remote part of rural Wales could attend classes at their small local college and then travel to London to sit for the final examinations. In the 1850s, the university went a step further, and it made its degree programmes available to independent students not affiliated to any college. In 1858, Queen Victoria granted a royal charter to what became known as the external system, today renamed international programmes. And this started the concept of distance learning. Now, if you could study anywhere in Britain, then by extension you could study anywhere in the world. And this is what happened. From the 1860s onwards, course materials were exported to locations around the British Empire, to Mauritius, Gibraltar, Canada, India, Australia, and so on. Students in those remote locations studied in their own time and then sat for exams at a recognised examination centre. And the context of imperial expansion is crucial, as by the middle of the 19th century, London was the administrative... Very strange. I don't know why that's happening. By the middle of the 19th century, let's try it again. London was the administrative and symbolic centre of a vast global empire. So the external system, what became the international programmes, which we still run today, was particularly attractive to people who lived and worked in remote locations around the empire. The people who are responsible for developing the political, legal and economic structures of Britain's colonies. So whilst we might be tempted to think of distance learning as a modern phenomenon today with online education and MOOCs and so on, the concept has actually been around for 150 years. And it's developed alongside Britain's transition from 19th century colonial power into the 20th century post-colonial era. Perhaps the most famous graduate of the international programmes is Nelson Mandela. He studied for his University of London law degree whilst imprisoned in the early 1960s, awaiting trial on charges of sedition and sabotage, and facing what was widely expected at the time to be a death sentence. Mandela's autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom, contains a moving passage explaining how he continued with his studies whilst awaiting the final judgment. I quote, "In the days before we were due to reconvene, I wrote papers for a set of London University examinations for my LLB. It might seem odd that I was taking law exams a few days before the verdict. It certainly seemed bizarre to my guards, who said I would not need a law degree where I was going. But I had continued my studies throughout the trial, and I wanted to take the examinations. I was single-minded about it, and I later realised that it was a way to keep myself from thinking negatively. I knew I would not be practising law again very soon, but I didn't want to consider the alternative. I passed the exams." The so-called Rivonia trial, which we can see here in an article from the London Times, attracted worldwide attention. It was condemned by the US Congress and the United Nations. In Britain, there was a candlelit vigil at St Paul's Cathedral, and 50 members of Parliament marched through London in protest. So this is a powerful indication of the value of higher education in what was a hugely significant historical moment that was resonating around the world. Let's return to the mid-19th century and the story of Victorian innovation in higher education. Because for the first time in Britain now, we start to see women gaining formal access to university. During the 1800s, the women's movement became increasingly well-organised and proactive. One of the key priorities for middle-class women in Britain was the right to access a liberal higher education in order to contribute more effectively as citizens. Now, this was a threat to the dominant view of the dominant Victorian view of women, of which you will learn about in due course. The Victorians essentially saw women as belonging in the home as wife and mother. But nevertheless, the status quo was being challenged. In 1849, Bedford College for Women was founded by the social campaigner Elizabeth Jesser Reed, who used her private wealth to buy a townhouse at number 47 Bedford Square in the Bloomsbury district of London. This is it's a beautiful Georgian square with a kind of park in the middle. You've probably walked through it actually if you walk from King's Cross down towards the British Museum. It's just close to there. And the building today is actually owned by Yale University Press. And a lot of the buildings in that square are owned by higher education institutions. Quite a lot of American universities have their kind of international office in those buildings. The vision for this new college was very socially progressive. Tuition fees were scaled according to students' background. Scholarships were available. And from the start, the college had very close links to the University of London. Lectures were given by professors from University College London, which is just down the road. And from the 1870s, students were able to gain degrees from the University of London. In 1900, the college became a formal member of the university's federal structure. One of the most prominent students at Bedford College in the early years was Sarah Parker Remond, the African-American abolitionist campaigner who visited Britain in 1859. She was working on behalf of the American Anti-Slavery Society. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, she stayed in Britain and gave lectures to huge crowds in towns across England, Ireland and Scotland, persuading the public to support the North against the Confederacy. This prompted widespread press coverage both in Britain and back in the US. And if you want to know why there was so much interest in the American Civil War in Britain around this time, ask your British Studies lecturers. Remond had been denied access to higher education in America because of her colour. So once settled in London, she enrolled at Bedford College. So here higher education is providing a role in fostering transnational networks, providing women with a space to develop their ideas and the skills to articulate them effectively in public. Bedford College paved the way for other women's institutions later in the 19th century, including Royal Holloway College, where I work. Holloway College was the initiative of a wealthy entrepreneur and his wife, Thomas and Jane Holloway. They made a fortune by selling fake medicinal pills and lotions. And there's sort of parallels with Harlexton, actually. Not that Gregory's money was obtained by dubious means, but a Victorian entrepreneur makes a stack of cash and then in an act of philanthropy decides to pour it into this splendid building. And so he modelled his college on the Chateau de Chambord in the Loire Valley, France. So a very kind of ornate, impressive building. This is an image taken from the opening ceremony in July 1886, which was attended by Queen Victoria. That's the Queen in her little tent, because we're located just down the road from Windsor, where the royal family live, so it's quite easy for her to pop down and open the college. The new institution was originally going to be named simply Holloway College, but 2 weeks before the opening ceremony, the staff at the college managed to get the Queen's permission to add Royal onto the title. So that's the way things work. She arrived and said, "You shall now be Royal Holloway College." Monarchs have a habit of doing that, you'll have noticed in Britain. In 1985, Royal Holloway merged with Bedford College for Women to form Royal Holloway and Bedford New College. So that's the kind of reason for giving the background to these two institutions. They're now the same university. This is the building today. My office is just down there. So this is what happens once you've worked at Harlexton. You have to work in cumulatively more impressive buildings. So I don't know where I'm going to go next, but again, also a bit like Harlexton, you kind of get used to working in what is actually quite a remarkable building. Now, moving into the early 20th century, Bedford College for Women provides us with a pioneering example of international education during the interwar era. In the 1920s, the college collaborated with two other organisations, the League of Red Cross Societies and the College of Nursing, to establish public health programmes for overseas nurses. My institution have recently digitised over 2,000 archival documents relating to the administration of these programmes. And it gives us a fascinating glimpse into a corner of women's history and the history of higher education in Britain. Now, we haven't got time to go through all 2,000 documents, but what I want to do is just kind of pull a few things out of the archives and talk about the issues they raise and how they kind of raise parallels actually with the role of internationalisation in education today. It's personally fascinating to see how predecessors faced the same challenges in different circumstances almost a century ago. Now, the impetus for Bedford College's nursing programmes was a new sense of international solidarity and cooperation in the years that emerged after the end of World War I. If the First World War came as the culmination of decades of increasing nationalism across Europe, it's not surprising that after the armistice in 1918, there was a reaction against nationalism and the emergence of several international organisations devoted to cooperation and understanding between nations. The most prominent of these was the League of Nations, founded in 1920 as an intergovernmental organisation devoted to maintaining world peace. For the women's movement, there was an increasing sense in the early 20th century that women should organise themselves across national borders, building on these previous Victorian ideas of transnational solidarity. International sisterhood, if you like. As the historian Marie Sandel has argued, quote, just as in countries such as Britain, where women's movements, rather than declining after securing the vote, in fact broadened their agendas, so too international groups became more determined to reach a wider collection of women following World War I, raising all sorts of challenges about how to bring about the new kind of sisterhood that this internationalism demanded. One way of achieving this international sisterhood was by focusing on women's professional identity. And the most prominent vocation that had emerged during the 19th century as being distinctively for women was that of nursing. This is epitomised, of course, in the work of Florence Nightingale. Before she became famous for her pioneering work during the Crimea War, Florence Nightingale wrote extensively about the social and educational challenges faced by women seeking a professional medical career. Now, the devastation on the battlefields of the First World War had prompted rapid advances in hygiene and nursing techniques, as well as a big recruitment drive in each of the national Red Cross organisations. The poster on the left is actually from the American Red Cross. The one on the right, I think, is Britain, but I need to check that. After the war, the need to maintain and promote this knowledge led to the establishment of the League of Red Cross Societies in Geneva, Switzerland in 1919. And this was formed through the cooperation of the organisations in Britain, France, Italy, Japan and the United States. And it was in fact the US who took the initiative in founding this new international organisation. And I was thinking about that on the train on the way up. The United States taking the lead in international humanitarian aid. How things change. One of the founding aims of the League was to provide advanced training in public health nursing to women from around the world. The idea was the women would then return to their home countries and develop the profession. In 1920, there was a trial year of these nursing programmes at King's College London, which by now had its own women's department. And then from 1921, the courses were delivered by Bedford College for Women. And the model was simple in theory. The League of Red Cross Societies provided the scholarship funding, okay, so donations would pour in from around the world, provide scholarships for these women. And Bedford College housed the students, provided a home for them, and organised the academic curriculum. And the programme covered both the theoretical and practical aspects of public health nursing. Specialist lecturers were selected from Bedford College and other London institutions to give classes on physiology, hygiene, bacteriology and so on. And students also undertook site visits and practical observations in clinics and hospitals in and around London. So there was sort of academic lecture content and practical medical content. Here we can see a proof copy of the original prospectus which was used to advertise the course. And you can see this, this is the prospectus from the first year at King's College. Someone's crossed it out, Bedford College for Women. So the League of Red Cross Societies in Geneva, course of training for public health nurses, as provided by the League of Red Cross Societies, to nurses selected by the National Red Cross Societies. So, you know, if you're in Canada, India, Japan, your national organisation would nominate you and say, go to London, you know, learn what you can for the year and come back and develop the profession. We'll just look at a couple more pages from this prospectus. Here you can see the entry requirements. You had to be between 23 and 30. You had to have had a good education. You had to already be a qualified nurse. So these were graduate programs. You had to have the sort of highest possible nursing qualification in your home country already. You had to be of good character. You had to be able to speak English. Okay, this is obviously fine if you're from Canada or the US, but more difficult if you were from a non-English speaking nation. And holidays. So short holidays will be allowed at Christmas and Easter, during which Students will have ample opportunity to visit the points of interest in and about London, under the direction of the League representative. So these women are very closely chaperoned. It's not like Harlexton at all, we just let you go off and do whatever you want. They all live together in the same house and sort of tightly controlled. Now, the point about English language is important. Many of the nurses who came to study in London faced the difficulty of studying in English. And a recurring theme in these records are the concerns raised by college staff over whether individual students had the language skills to cope with the programme. In October 1928, the committee managing the courses considered the case of several students who were struggling with their work, including these two cases of students from India and Japan. So here we've got Miss Shanadabai Naidu from India, and the report that the committee is hearing is that the candidate was not up to standard. Education was limited, she was finding it difficult to write reports through lack of education. It's thought very doubtful whether she'll be able to benefit from the theoretical side of the course. So the decision is they're going to kick her out, okay, it's game over. She's not sufficiently qualified, the League of Red Cross Societies be asked to withdraw her. Second student, Miss Natsui Inui from Japan, report this candidate was not uneducated but found the language difficult. She could understand and write it but could not speak it with any facility. But her teacher in English reported that she was quite promising. So in this case, they're going to let her continue. It was resolved that in view of the favourable report from her English teacher, Miss Natsui Inui be allowed to continue the course up to Christmas, when her progress be further reported on. Okay, so we wonder what happens to this student. Remember that student's name, because we're going to come back to that later on. So through these records, we start to get a sense of how the college was tackling the problem of maintaining academic standards, of assessing students' language abilities before they arrived in Britain, and the challenges faced by the students once they were here. And of course, universities still face very similar challenges today, although our support and understanding of these issues has increased immensely. The students' diverse backgrounds and the challenges of adapting to a new language and culture inevitably had an impact on assessment. In May 1930, the decision was taken to abolish a formal end-of-year examination because of the stress it was causing students. So imagine that, you get too stressed, it's okay, cancel the exam. What's fascinating about this episode, don't get any ideas, what's fascinating is the way that this exam stress is described in the records. So this is another extract from the same committee. And this is one of the tutors talking about the students. Mrs. Carter testified to the injurious effect on the health of the students caused by anxiety in connection with the examination at the end of the year. She pointed out to the committee that each one regarded herself as a representative of her nation, and that anyone who failed was marked for life as having failed her country. The whole idea became exaggerated in their minds, and the national responsibility was too great a burden in many cases. So there's this extraordinary implication that students were experiencing exam stress as a manifestation of their national identity. And Harlexton students, I think there's a serious point here, because if you do badly in your British Studies exams, remember you're not just letting yourselves down, you're letting America down. The evidence in the archive shows how the international programme struggled with funding challenges from the outset, particularly in providing scholarships for students from poorer countries. And of course, many of these countries were still rebuilding from the devastating impact of the First World War. These problems were then exacerbated by the impact of the Wall Street crash in 1929. By 1930, Britain was experiencing a severe economic downturn and rising unemployment. But the programmes were saved by the intervention of the International Council of Nurses, another one of these international organisations. In 1932, they established a trust fund in honour of Florence Nightingale. The Florence Nightingale International Foundation supported scholarships for the Bedford College programmes throughout the 1930s. Here we can see an example of the new certificates that were produced bearing the iconic image of the Victorian nurse in the lamp. For the women's movement, the figure of Florence Nightingale had a symbolic significance that went beyond the nursing profession. This commemoration was part of a process of elevating her to cult status as a symbol of women's intellectual and educational achievement. And still today, International Nursing Day is celebrated on the 12th of May, the anniversary of Florence Nightingale's birth. So there were challenges of language, of anxiety, of cultural difference, and of finance. But it's also clear that these international programmes were having a positive impact on the college, providing it with an opportunity to promote the values of cooperation and mutual understanding. This is demonstrated through the speeches that were given at the annual graduation ceremonies. Here is an extract from the speech given by the principal, Mrs. Jebb, in the summer of 1932, reported in this article from the British Journal of Nursing. So she said, "It is a great privilege to us at the college to have connected with it this particular bit of education. Although we hope that the international nurses who come to us take something away that we can give them, I feel that they bring us a very great deal in exchange. Moreover, I feel that in a world which seems today to be rent asunder by national conflicts and national antagonisms, it's a great happiness and a great encouragement to see all this real solid bit of international cooperation." The records of the international nursing programmes reveals the tension between a new sense of international cooperation after the First World War and the fact that relations between Britain and the countries these women represented were still defined by Britain's role as a global imperial power. The British media were not shy in presenting these courses in a patriotic light, as we can see in this article from the London Evening Standard, which reported on the graduation ceremony in 1937. So world's nurses are copying Britain. You know, this is a great example of benefits of British education. And this is a journalist, the special correspondent, has been to the graduation ceremony at which there were alumni, so former students who graduated a few years ago have come back for this graduation ceremony. So he's talking to students who've been through the nursing programmes. I'll just pull out a few extracts from this journalist's report. Reference here to the League of Nations. Okay, so by 1937, things not going so well in terms of international relations. This League of Nurses has established a League of Nations which never disagrees. Today I met some of these nurses who have only just arrived in London. Okay, and do you remember her? 10 years later, she obviously did okay. Miss Natsuyoni from Japan is the tiniest nurse I've ever seen. I had to include that. She told me how Japanese nurses, inspired by British traditions and training, are fighting against superstitions, particularly in the villages. Okay, so she obviously did okay, completed the course, gone back to Japan, and closely involved in developing the profession. Latvian health centres and children's clinics are planned exactly on English lines, even to the style of the baby's clothing. And Miss Eva Aito has come from Finland, which, like Czechoslovakia, Estonia and Latvia, has established British ideas through its medical and nursing services. Okay. So there's a paternalistic tone to much of the description of the international students. It's clear they were being encouraged to feel grateful for having the benefits of a British education. Nevertheless, the nursing programmes were delivering on their original objectives. And we know that many students did go on to become leading figures in the health profession in their home countries. And throughout the 1920s and 30s as a whole, over 300 students enrolled on these programmes from 46 different countries, including far-flung places as Iceland, China, New Zealand, Paraguay, South Africa, and so on. The tragedy, of course, is that by the late 1930s, any hope of international cooperation in Europe was being suffocated by the forces of nationalism. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. And on the 3rd of September, Britain and France declared war on Germany. And 3 days later, on the 6th of September, the secretary of Bedford College writes this very poignant letter to the Florence Nightingale Foundation, informing them that the programmes had closed and the students sent home. During the Second World War, the students of Bedford College were evacuated to Cambridge, and that was the end of the international programmes. So this innovative educational experiment was very much framed by the two world wars, beginning during the optimism of the early 1920s and ending as Europe descended into war once again. But by looking at this example from just one institution during this era, I think we can recognise themes that resonate with the international dimension of higher education today. This is very much an institutional view of the programmes. What's missing from the archives is the view of the students themselves. It would be fascinating to access personal diaries or correspondence to learn about the experience of being a study abroad student during this era. However, we do have some evidence of how the faculty perceived the significance of the programmes, including this 1925 essay by the American nurse Edith H. Smith, who I mentioned at the outset. Edith Smith had a remarkable career. Originally from California, she served in the US Navy during the First World War, and then in the 1920s came to Europe to work for the League of Red Cross Societies, during which time she was teaching at Bedford College. She later went on to work for the Federal Office of Defence and Welfare during the Second World War, training military nurses. And then she founded the School of Nursing at Syracuse University in New York. In this short essay, she describes the formation of the international programmes and their significance for the students and staff of Bedford College. And I'd like to conclude with some of her words. Living together during this year, these women form lasting friendships and discuss each other's problems, which are common to them all. For each of them, Bedford College for Women has the added significance of an alma mater in a foreign land, an alma mater forever associated with their work, where their year of study will have broadened their tolerance and deepened their sympathies, where, among other things, they will have learned the splendid spirit of internationalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. I think some really interesting historical perspectives on contemporary issues. We've got a few minutes for questions, if people have any, assuming you're happy to.
Fire away. Yeah.
Earlier when you were talking about Royal Holloway,
Yeah.
College, you said, did you say it was more like Chambord, Chateau Chambord?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not an architectural historian, so I'm not, it's not really my thing, but it's another example of this kind of Victorian take on modelling continental fashion, essentially. Yeah, so kind of trying to recreate here what they do in France. And there are parallels with Harlexton because Royal Holloway has a portrait gallery, okay, with the existing original kind of portraits, a lot of important artwork which students can see, and a chapel as well. So kind of a lot of original features still in the building, but mostly just offices and classrooms now. Yep.
So the international nursing program didn't open up again after World War II?
No, they didn't. No, I mean those particular programs were just sort of 1920s and 30s. We didn't have time to go into more detail. Bedford College, I mean, even before those programs started, it had already established a reputation in the kind of whole field of public health. In fact, it had the first social science department for any UK university and the first professor of social science in the UK. So later in the 20th century, it was doing sort of comparable, academic work, but not this kind of idea of a model, a program for international students.
I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, I'm sorry.
Probably not.
I was wondering about the term global citizenship.
Yeah.
Do you know when it starts to come into currency, or if there's a particular context?
No, I mean, there's a lesson here actually in terms of doing presentations, because the but also it's British studies, isn't it? The scope for this lecture was too ambitious, basically. Okay, so I started off with kind of grand ideas, and then as always happens, when I started writing it, I thought there's just too much stuff. I got in touch with a lot of former Harlexton students, and several of them wrote really, I mean, Christy wrote like pages of stuff, you know, and I just realized I don't have time to, it's like a whole different lecture, right, about global citizenship. But that was my starting point actually, it was going back to my former students and saying to them, what does global citizenship mean to you? What did it mean to you before you came to Harlexton? What does it mean to you after Harlexton? You know, what's your kind of understanding of this? And I mean, this is the whole problem with globalism, with global citizenship. One of the criticisms is that it's too vague, right? It's too generic, it's too nebulous. You can't pin down, you know, Harlexton College's website as part of the mission and purpose on the page about mission, purpose and vision, I think it is, at Harlexton College. It says something about instilling in students the necessity of a global view. You know, so Western universities, I guess from the 70s, 80s onwards, you know, this has been a dominant aspect of educational philosophy. And one of the things that was really interesting about teaching out in India is you realise that actually a lot of ideas about global education and global citizenship are actually Western ideas. Okay, so what we're actually doing is it's a kind of ongoing tradition of the West imposing its intellectual superiority over the rest of the world. You know, other parts of the world where, you know, being a global citizen is not really considered a priority. But then, of course, a lot of higher education systems in other parts of the world, Singapore, South America, Southeast Asia, are modelled on the European higher education system. So then you've got this kind of paradox that, you know, you look at somewhere like Singapore, which is, you know, the big booming place at the moment for as a destination for higher education. And a lot of what it's doing, we recognise in terms of what happens in the West. So, yeah, I find this issue fascinating. I don't think there's kind of easy answers to it, but I think we need more awareness of what we mean when we talk about globalism, particularly the kind of political dimension of it, definitely. Rambling response to that question. I'd be interested to know what you guys think. I mean, what do you know, global citizenship is there, it'll be in the strategy and the policies of your institutions as it is, you know, at Harlexton. You're told it's important. What do you understand by it? What does it mean to you? Yeah.
Well, I'd say I understand a lot more about it now than I did 3 weeks ago.
Right.
But
Thank you. Good answer.
Yeah.
it's very just, whenever I lived in the US, it was just very like, kind of just the thing you said, you know? Like, oh, I'm a global citizen, which I think a lot of people in the US just think means I'm a Democrat or something like
right.
that. They just think it means
it's yeah, you're kind of progressive liberal. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's true.
But being, as I have 2 other countries now and traveling abroad and seeing, it really puts it into perspective that your culture and your country are not the culture and the country, they're a culture and a country, and it's, you don't really get that until you immerse yourself in others.
The kind of broadening of perspective and being challenged as well is important, I think. Somewhere, yeah.
Building off of that, I think that a lot of people who haven't done extensive traveling or traveling at all don't really understand the difference, and not to say that I do absolutely at all, but the difference between being aware of the rest of the world as it affects you and actually participating in the rest of the world.
Yeah, there's definitely an important distinction between internationalism or globalism and the kind of educational concept of global citizenship, which is about kind of building skills and knowledge, isn't it, and kind of your role in the world. That's good. Any other thoughts? I find it interesting. I find it very interesting.
I have a question about the statement with Brexit.
Yeah.
How is that going to affect
It's terrible.
teachers?
It's a mess. And I'm not joking. The day after that referendum result last year, it was a sad place to be on a university campus in the UK. Nobody saw it coming. This is part of the shock, right? Nobody I know or work with, you know, had said they were going to vote for Brexit. So that's this idea of disconnect, right? That's maybe my fault. Why didn't I talk to anybody who said they were thinking about voting Leave? But it has massive implications. You know, we've got a lot of European staff, people who have lived and worked at my university for 20 years. They're raising families here. What's going to happen to them? You know, you go on the web page of any UK university now. What you're likely to see, if not on the homepage, but somewhere in the website, is a kind of EU crisis, you know, help page. So universities are organising, you know, sessions for staff, advice about the kind of legal impacts and so on. Yeah, the implication, I mean, you know, for research funding, for the Erasmus scheme, which is a kind of student mobility program around Europe, there are, you know, I mean, the government came out, you know, early on and said, oh, we'll protect what we can, but it's, of course, we don't have the power to make that decision. That's the whole thing, isn't it? So yeah, potentially, you know, disastrous. I went to an interesting lecture by the chief executive of the Higher Education Funding Council, okay, which is the kind of the organisation that the government devolves responsibility to look after British universities. And she was actually quite positive. She sort of was making the case that actually when you look globally, you know, in terms of finance, in terms of income coming from Europe as opposed to the rest of the world, you know, that the impact shouldn't be too bad. It's kind of manageable. But it's much more about the symbolic message, I think. You know. I mean, whatever happens, you know, life is going to carry on, isn't it? But it's the message it's sending out. But, you know, you look at the University of Nottingham, for example, which, you know, describes itself as Britain's global university. So it's, you know, it's sort of competitive thing. It's like we're more global than you. And Nottingham University, because some of you are going to go to Nottingham, or you have been already, I think. You go to that university, you know, it has campuses in China and Malaysia, I think. It's a big kind of global operation. But there's a question there about, you know, the people in Nottingham. Do they feel connected with the University of Nottingham? Has the university been doing everything it can to kind of bring people along with it? You know, universities are massive employers. You know, they contribute a lot economically to regions, but yet somehow that seems to have been, you know, completely ignored in what's happened. So I think there's a lot of people in universities feeling a bit sort of aggrieved, almost as if the public doesn't understand, you know, what they're trying to do. But, you know, well, just universities, aren't they? I mean, life goes on.